So I'd like to go back to the lifestyle, to some specifics of the lifestyle. At the risk of us both being cursed, can we can we talk in a bit more? Could you talk in a bit more detail about initiation rites? And as one of my colleagues at Quillette, Zoe, my colleague here at Quillette, put it, of course I'm interested in ritual circumcision, um, but also other initiation rituals, violent and otherwise.
Hmm. Okay, so I will start at the beginning. The oldest sign of an initiation ritual, and just to let people know, like usually this is like the crossing from the being a child of like 10 or 12 and then becoming an official adult, right? Um,
Mm.
Mungo Man, or the skeleton that's the fossil that used to be known as Mungo Man. It's actually might be a woman. We don't actually know for certain, but his lower incisors had been removed during his life, like his lower, not his incisors, his canines. His lower canines had been knocked out with like a chisel during his life, and
Ouch.
yeah, I can't imagine. I've met people on Twitter who've had this done, and they say it's incredibly painful. You can't you can't eat anything cold or hot for like a month. It's still happening. It's happening today, but not the lower canines. That was unique. That's never been seen in any other fossils or living cultures. Um, the Tasmanians, they would knock out like a front tooth, like an incisor. They would also do scarification, like cutting designs and lines in your chest or your shoulders, and then they would open up the wounds, rub in dirt and ash, which would like prevent healing and create these large like keloid scars. So that was a very common one. So Tasmania shows that the scarification and the tooth avulsion were probably the two most ancient types of initiation ritual. But
Mm.
in Australia, okay, so like the eastern half of Australia, they were still doing tooth avulsion, scarification. In the southwest, by like Melbourne, they would lay the kid down on the ground and they would pluck out all of his hairs on his body, which sounds very unpleasant. Like that was probably
Mm.
not a very
Mm.
pleasant one. Um, but there was a very interesting religious movement, you could say, that was spreading probably either from the coast, potentially like the Kimberley coast, or from Central Australia. And this religious movement was practicing circumcision, and it had spread out like covering most of the continent. And there was like a border between the tribes that had adopted this initiation ritual and the ones that were still practicing the more traditional ritual of just like knocking out teeth. And the tribes, they hated each other. They thought they were like inhuman, and the circumcising people thought the other people weren't real men or real women, right? So that was a very interesting phenomenon. And that's basically what it sounds like. They would basically take the foreskin and use a stone knife and cut it off. Um, of course, because it was taboo to talk about, the boy that was having it happen to, like, he had no idea what was going to happen, right? So the men would just,
Mm.
at some point, they would seize the boy, take him through all these different rituals and stuff, uh, lay him down on the ground, or create a living table out of bodies. Like the men would lie on the ground or stand on the ground, and the boy would be laid on top of them like an altar. Sometimes the men would cut their arms and sprinkle the boy with blood. Um, but yeah, there's very very interesting rituals, and they varied, of course, from tribe to tribe. But but yeah, so then the boy would be circumcised, and then most of the tribes, there was an even newer ritual that is called subincision, and that was also spreading out. And most of the tribes that circumcised also did this later initiation ritual, which is one of the most insanely hardcore rituals that I've ever heard of. Um, and I assume, is this podcast R rated? Can I don't
Yes.
okay, good,
You can say whatever you like. Yeah.
great.
Um,
Okay, that's good to know. So okay, so subincision, and whenever I talk about it on Twitter, like I try not to get into it too much. I let people do their own research, but they would basically you take the man or the boy's penis, and you would use a stone knife. They had these special ritual knives, and they would slice open their urethra all the way down the shaft, and then they would spread out the penis like on a stone rock, or hold it up to like fire to like stop the bleeding. Okay, and it's called subincision, and it still happens today. There's still tribes out in like the more rural, or not tribes. They're not really living in foraging bands anymore, but there are people that still practice this. And they wouldn't always necessarily do the whole urethra. Sometimes they would do like one little cut, and then as the man grew older, like he would go through various stages of initiation. And there's a ton of controversy over like why they did this, what the reasoning was, and nobody really knows for certain. Um, and the tribes that did that, they would also do a female version, where the men would take a young girl, usually around like puberty, and they would cut open her vagina. So they would cut open, like if she was like a virgin, which they usually were, because it was against the law to have sex with an uninitiated girl, because she wasn't adult, right? Um, so they would cut her open, but they would also like usually cut the perineum and enlarge it that way as well. And there's not a lot written about this, and some people try to like deny that it exists. But as far as I can tell, it is something that was practiced and still is practiced. I've actually had Twitter comments from people saying they knew people that actually tried to avoid it. So, and then sometimes that would also involve like sex with multiple men, over a course of a day or multiple days. Um, she was basically like a bunch of different men were given access to her. So yeah, not a very pleasant thing. Like it was but I mean what the men went through was pretty rough too. So I think there was a lot of, I mean, there's a whole nother thing about like why these initiations happen, right? I mean, like fraternities do the same thing on a lesser degree, right? Like, I mean, the military does the same thing on a lesser degree. Like trauma bonding, or like this whole thing of like experiencing extreme physical pain and trauma, obviously has some sort of benefit, because almost like so many different groups of humans do it. But like I said, this is the most extreme version I've ever heard.